Lorenzo finished closing the corral gate for the last time and didn't turn to look back at the big house. He knew that if he turned around, something in his chest was going to break in front of everyone, and that was not something he was going to give his brother. Faustino watched him from the porch with his arms crossed. "Take your clothes and your pride, brother. You don't own a thing on this land anymore." Lorenzo didn't answer. He hauled the sack onto his shoulder and gave a low whistle, and out of the shadows of the stable came Centella, his father's old dog, limping on her back leg, her eyes fixed on him. If you've ever seen a man lose everything and end up with nothing but an old dog and his dignity, you know that sometimes that's more than it looks like. Subscribe to Tales of the Old Countryside and hit the bell, because this is one of those stories you don't forget easily. Barely 9 days had passed since they buried Don Refugio Salcedo, master of the La Providencia estate in the highlands of Michoacán, and already Faustino, the older brother, had sent for the town notary to read a will that, according to him, left everything in his name. Lorenzo, the younger one, had spent those 9 days barely sleeping, keeping the cattle calm through the coming and going of people arriving to pay respects, and crying alone at night where no one could see him. His sister-in-law, Herminia, a woman with a sharp tongue and eyes that never met yours straight on, was the first to say out loud what Faustino didn't dare. Here, the one who worked with his head inherits with his head. The one who worked with his hands can go find another piece of land to get them dirty on. No one in the room said a word. Doa Asuncin, the town midwife who had helped bring both brothers into the world, lowered her eyes and slipped out slowly, pretending she had somewhere to be. The will the notary read that afternoon handed the entire estate to Faustino. The house, the farmland, the cattle, even the family name over the door. Lorenzo didn't get so much as a furrow of dirt. Faustino stood up before the notary had even finished folding the paper and said, without looking his brother in the eye, that he had until Sunday to clear out his things. Lorenzo thought of his father, of Don Refugio's rough hands teaching him to brand a calf, of the nights the two of them sat by the fire while Faustino slept in the city studying things that never brought him home in time for anything that mattered. He thought that maybe his father never imagined the will would end up splitting his sons the way you split a carcass. Sunday came fast. Lorenzo folded the 2 changes of clothes he owned, his father's hat and an old pocket knife that had belonged to his grandfather. That was all he had. Outside, Faustino had already had a new sign nailed over the gate bearing his name alone. A young hired hand, one of the ones Faustino had recently taken on who didn't know the family's history, saw Lorenzo hauling his sack and looked away, uncomfortable, but said nothing. No one said anything. That was the worst punishment, worse than the lost land, the silence of people who knew the truth and chose not to look at it. Centella followed him to the gate without Lorenzo calling her. Faustino tried to whistle her back, but the dog didn't even turn her head. "That dog belongs to the estate," Faustino said, his voice a touch louder than it needed to be. Lorenzo crouched down, rested his hand on the dog's head, and gave the only answer he spoke all afternoon. Then let the estate come and get her. He turned and walked toward the main road, the sack on his shoulder and the old dog at his heels, leaving behind the only home he had ever known. He walked nearly 2 leagues under a sun already starting to sink, the dust of the road clinging to his boots and the sack growing heavier on his shoulder with every mile, until he reached the Higuera ranch, where Don Cirillo, a hand who had worked his whole life for the Salcedo family, now lived in retirement in a small adobe house with his wife. Don Cirillo was the one who had taught both Lorenzo and Faustino to ride when they were boys, though over the years Faustino had stopped greeting him on the street, as if the old hand's years of labor had been buried right alongside Don Refugio. When Lorenzo reached his door, soaked in sweat with the dog limping behind him, Don Cirillo didn't ask a single question. He just opened the door wider and said, "I knew you'd come. Come on in, son." What Lorenzo didn't know was that Don Cirillo had spent days expecting this visit, ever since he'd heard, in town, how the inheritance was being carved up. Don Cirillo's house smelled of wood smoke and fresh ground coffee, a smell that settled into Lorenzo's chest like a comfort that didn't ask permission. His wife, Doa Trinidad, served him a plate of beans without asking if he was hungry, knowing that a man who has just lost everything rarely has the nerve to ask. She set a glass of cool water beside it too, and a tortilla straight off the comal, without a word. The way someone knows, after years of ranch life, that sometimes all a man needs before he can speak is for somebody to fill his plate without asking him anything. Centella lay down by the door, keeping watch, as if she still had a ranch to guard. "That's no ordinary dog," Don Cirillo said, looking at her with something like respect. "She was your father's shadow. Went everywhere with him, even to meetings with the notary." Lorenzo didn't think much of those words that night. He was too tired to think about anything except the weight of the sack and the emptiness of having no home. Outside, the wind had begun stirring the branches of an old ash tree by the door, and somewhere in a nearby corral, a calf called for its mother, a long bleat that faded into the darkness of the hills. They offered him a cot on the covered porch, and though Lorenzo hadn't slept well in 2 nights, that night he still couldn't. He lay staring at the roof beams, listening to Centella breathe slowly beside him, and for the first time since the burial, he let the tears come without anyone watching. He fell asleep with his hand resting on the old dog's back, searching, in that aging animal, for the last thing he had left of his father. The next day, Don Cirillo woke him before dawn, not because there was urgent work, but because he knew a man needs his hands busy when his heart is broken. They started with the simplest tasks, milking the 2 cows Don Cirillo still kept, mending a fallen fence, hauling firewood. Lorenzo worked in silence, and Don Cirillo let him, knowing that words are sometimes too much. "Work doesn't heal," he told him on the 3rd day, as they sharpened a machete together. "But it keeps the hands busy, while the heart learns to carry what it's been given." Lorenzo nodded without a word, but something in that sentence stayed with him. A small routine took shape. He'd rise before the rooster crowed, set the coffee pot over the fire while Doa Trinidad still slept, and head out with Centella to walk the edge of the creek before the day's work began. The dog always sniffed the same stones near an old mesquite tree, as if searching for something she never quite found, then trotted back to Lorenzo, almost apologizing for wandering off. He didn't think much of it the first few times. It wasn't until the 2nd week that he began to notice the dog always took the same path, with the same insistence, like someone repeating a prayer. It was Don Cirillo who gave Lorenzo an old notebook, its cover worn leather, which he said his father had asked him to keep safe in case it was ever needed. Lorenzo opened it that night by the fire and found Don Refugio's tight handwriting, noting ranch expenses, planting dates, the births of calves, and here and there, loose lines that didn't read like bookkeeping at all, thoughts about his sons, about what he hoped for each of them, about the fear that the land would end up splitting the family in 2. Lorenzo turned the pages slowly, recognizing in every stroke the hand that had taught him to brand a calf, and felt that his father was, in some way, still speaking to him. One afternoon a neighbor, Doa Rosora, arrived at the Higuera ranch carrying a basket of eggs and a piece of cheese wrapped in a cloth. "Heard Don Refugio's boy was staying out here," she said, without further explanation, setting the basket on the table. That small gesture, no conditions attached, no questions asked, reminded Lorenzo that not everyone in town had chosen to look the other way. Doa Trinidad, grateful, offered her a coffee, and the two women sat talking on the porch while Lorenzo finished stacking the firewood, listening without meaning to, learning little by little that the whole town already knew his story, and that not all of them told it with cruelty. That night, as they ate the cheese with fresh tortillas, Don Cirillo mentioned, offhand, that word around town was that Faustino and his wife had started selling off cattle at a price too good to be believable, and that some outsider had been asking odd questions about La Providencia's property lines. Doa Trinidad, pouring more coffee, added that people were also saying Herminia had sent for fine cloth from the city, like someone who already feels she owns something she's barely begun to hold on to. Lorenzo listened to all of it without a word, chewing slowly, feeling that life at La Providencia went on without him, like a river that waits for no one. One night, while Lorenzo was helping mend an old saddle, he broke down. It was something small that knocked him over. Buried at the bottom of his sack, he found the embroidered handkerchief his mother had given him before she died. The initials of all three of them, father and sons, stitched into one corner. He sat on the porch floor with the handkerchief in his hands and cried the way he hadn't even cried at the burial. Don Cirillo sat beside him without a word. Let him cry. And only once Lorenzo had calmed down did he place a hand on his shoulder and say, "Crying doesn't make you less of a man, son. It makes you one who still feels." Scintilla came over and rested her head on Lorenzo's knee, as if she too wanted to comfort him in her own way. As the days passed, Lorenzo began noticing something more in Scintilla. Every time they neared the old mesquite by the creek, the dog would scratch at the ground a little with her good paw, then stop, as if waiting for him to understand something she already knew. "That dog doesn't dig for nothing," Don Cirillo told him one morning, watching the scene with narrowed eyes. "I saw her do that same thing once, about 2 years back, when your father brought her out here alone, without telling anyone where he was going." It was the first time it occurred to Lorenzo that maybe this old dog carried not only his father's affection, but also some of his silence. What Lorenzo didn't know was that his father had made that same walk, with that same dog, more than once in the last months of his life, and that he hadn't done it out of habit or distraction. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since Lorenzo arrived at the Higuera ranch. One Sunday afternoon, while mending the old saddle with Scintilla dozing beside him, he noticed that the dog's rawhide collar had an odd stitch along the bottom, thicker, newer than the rest of the leather. Sewn into the old dog's collar was a folded paper that was about to change everything Lorenzo thought he knew about his father's inheritance, though he didn't know it yet. He worked it loose carefully, thinking it might just be an old repair, but his fingers caught a small, hard lump hidden between the layers of hide. With his grandfather's pocket knife, Lorenzo opened the stitching slowly, with the same care he might have used to tend a wound, and pulled out a paper folded several times over, wrapped in a scrap of waxed cloth to keep it from rotting in the damp. He unfolded it with trembling hands, not from cold, but from something like the fear of expecting too much from something so small. It was a notarized document, dated barely 4 months before Don Refugio's death, in which his father acknowledged having secretly purchased, in his own name, a spring on the highland tract bordering La Providencia. A spring that, according to notes scrawled in the margin in Don Refugio's own hand, carried water rights worth several times more than all the farmland put together. The document named Lorenzo, not Faustino, as sole heir to that parcel and its water rights, with a short note at the end, so that the one who worked the land with his hands will one day never have to ask anyone's permission to live off it. Don Cirillo, when Lorenzo showed him the paper with a cracking voice, read it twice, slowly, his lips moving in silence, then took off his hat something Lorenzo had never seen him do without a religious reason. "This is real, son," he said. "I rode into town with your father that time he went to see the notary. Never asked him why. Now I understand why the dog never stopped scratching near the mesquite. That's where the spring comes up." The next day, Don Cirillo insisted the two of them go into town to show the document to the old scribe who had helped Don Refugio with his papers years before. A man with shaking hands but a sharp memory who recognized the signature and seal at once. "I drew up that paper with my own hands," the scribe said, adjusting his glasses. Don Refugio came alone, didn't tell a soul, not even his eldest son. Told me he wanted the land he'd bought with a lifetime of sweat to end up in the hands that would actually work it. Lorenzo walked out of that office with the document pressed to his chest, feeling, for the first time in weeks, that the weight he carried wasn't only grief anymore, but purpose too. That night, for the first time since his father's burial, Lorenzo felt something that wasn't sorrow or resentment, but a small, trembling hope. Like a candle, just lit in a dark room. It took barely 2 days for the news to reach La Providencia, passed from mouth to mouth, that the outsider who'd been asking about property lines actually wanted the spring's water, and that someone in town had mentioned an old document of Don Refugio's that no one had seen in the will. The news traveled faster than water itself, from the butcher's to the church, from the church to the mill, until there wasn't a house in town that didn't know, before Faustino did, that something didn't add up in the inheritance he'd carved up so quickly. Faustino, as Doa Rosora and Don Cirillo himself told it later, went pale when he heard, and that same afternoon had 2 horses saddled. Lorenzo had barely enough time to tuck the document away again, now wrapped in a clean cloth inside his father's notebook, when he heard hooves approaching the Higuera ranch. Faustino arrived with his face red from anger and sun, Herminia behind him, gripping the reins with a tightness that betrayed more nerves than authority. "I've come for what's mine," Faustino said, dismounting without waiting for a reply. "I heard you've been talking about some notary's paper. Whatever you've got is part of the estate, and the estate is mine." Lorenzo stepped out onto the porch with Centella pressed against his leg and said nothing yet. Herminia, without dismounting, fired off the first accusation in that sharp voice of hers. This poor devil probably stole some old paper off the desk before he left, just to invent some claim he never had. Don Cirillo, who had come out behind Lorenzo, answered without raising his voice, with the calm that only age gives a man. "The only one who went digging through desks that weren't his was the notary you two hired, the very Sunday you buried Don Refugio." Faustino clenched his jaw but said nothing, because he knew it was true. Lorenzo then drew the document from the notebook and held it, not yet extending it, looking his brother in the eye for the first time since the day he'd been thrown off the land. "Our father signed this paper 4 months before he died," he said, his voice low, but steady. "And he hid it where he knew no one, not you, not your notary, would ever bother to look, inside the collar of an old dog you yourself wanted to leave behind." Faustino tried to snatch the paper, but Don Cirillo stepped between them, faster than his age would suggest. "The town judge already saw this document this morning," Don Cirillo lied smoothly, though Lorenzo had barely shown it to him the night before. "So whatever you're thinking of doing no longer depends on tearing it out of his hands by force, in front of half the neighborhood who already noticed you came in at a gallop." Faustino looked around and noticed, for the first time, that 2 hands from the neighboring ranch had wandered over to watch, and that Doa Rosora was watching openly from her doorway. Herminia pulled at the reins, uneasy under the stairs. It was in that moment that Lorenzo spoke the line people in town would repeat for months afterward: "Blood family sometimes falls apart the moment there's weight to carry." But loyalty stays. And in the end, it's the only thing that weighs anything at all. No one said a word for several seconds. Faustino, his face twisted between anger and something like shame, climbed back onto his horse. "This isn't over," he said, though his voice no longer carried the confidence it had when he arrived. Herminia followed without a word, and the two of them rode off down the main road, this time with no one stopping them or shouting after them, because there was no longer any need to. When the dust of the road had settled, Lorenzo realized he'd gone several minutes without breathing right, his chest tight, as if he'd been hauling a sack of stones. He sat down slowly on the porch step, and Centella climbed up clumsily to rest her head on his legs. Don Cirillo put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because some victories don't need words, only silence to settle into. 4 months passed. The town court, after reviewing the document and confirming the signature and seal of Don Refugio's original notary, recognized the spring and the Highland parcel as Lorenzo's legitimate property. Faustino, as it turned out, had to sell off part of La Providencia's cattle to pay debts he'd taken on, believing the outsider's money would come through soon. And around town, little by little, people began greeting him with less warmth than before. Not for what he'd done with the land, but for what he'd done to his brother. That spring, Lorenzo's parcel already had a small cabin freshly built beside the spring, with a modest corral where the first head of cattle he'd been able to buy, thanks to selling the water rights at a fair price, not to the outsider, but to the valley's own ranchers who'd needed that water for years, were beginning to fatten. At dusk, as the sun dropped behind the Sierra, the cows and calves could be seen making their slow way down toward the corral, fat and unhurried, with that easy gait of animals that no longer fear anything. Don Cirillo came by that afternoon, as he did every week, for a cup of coffee on the new porch, and stood watching the cattle come down with a smile that needed no explanation. Centella, older now, slower, but with the same bright eyes, lay down between the two men, as if she had finally finished the job she'd carried alone for years. "You know what's strangest about all this?" Lorenzo said, pouring the old man his coffee. "If my brother hadn't thrown me out, I never would have paid this dog enough attention to find what she'd been carrying." Don Cirillo nodded slowly. "Sometimes God uses even the ones who hurt us to carry us where he'd already planned for us to go. Son, you just have to hold on through the road. Sometimes life pushes us out the hardest door of a house to lead us, without our knowing it at the time, to the doorstep of a home we hadn't built yet. Sometimes the one who seems to carry the least worth, like an old, limping dog, turns out to be the one quietly carrying the full weight of an inheritance of justice. Have you ever had the person you least expected turn out to be the one who needed you most? If this story touched something in your heart, leave us a comment telling us what part of Mexico or where in the world you're watching from. Give it a like, subscribe to Tales of the Old Countryside, and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Share it with someone who's ever felt left with empty hands, because sometimes life, God willing, finds a way to give each of us back what truly belongs to us. A heartfelt embrace to you, and until the next story. That night, late as he settled the cattle in before turning in himself, Lorenzo crouched beside Centella, stroked her graying head, and whispered, almost hoping no one else would hear, "I belong wherever I was loved, old girl. And you always knew it, before I did."